Well, for everyone out there that maybe hasn't seen the film yet, Beyond Clueless is a really it's so wonderful, I guess is my main word, but it's such an impressive use of found footage filmmaking. It has a story, it has a flow. You don't need to know what the clips are, and it really relies on kind of sense memory. Rewatching all these favorite movies, I'm curious if you have a favorite sequence or scene in your film, and which of the teen movies I think did maybe you re-find or re-fall in love with in a different way when in doing the project.
Yeah, so in Beyond Clueless, I think the scene that always comes to mind is the sequence in the swimming pool. Mainly because I think at the time, like, it was the first film I'd ever made, and I was only really, as a viewer, beginning to get to grips with essay filmmaking and video essay as a form and kind of discover the possibilities of it. And I think naively in my head, when I'd been thinking about the film before starting to make it, there'd been this sort of distinction between the sequences that are kind of like an analysis of an individual film and have narration and a kind of, this deconstruction of a given thing. And then the montages, which I think I was still thinking of as just as almost like the kind of fun that would accompany the film. And hopefully they are fun. But I think the thing I only realized while making it was the extent to which those sequences not only could be criticism themselves, but actually by far the most effective criticism, and that like the archive, the material itself is what tells the story. And even now, having made a load of other archive films and watched so many more archive films, that's always my favorite thing that archive filmmaking can do, is let the archive kind of speak to something more than any other thing you could introduce into the mix could do. And so yeah, it was really that swimming pool sequence, which for anyone who hasn't seen the film is a montage of scenes from teen movies where two people, usually a teenage boy and a teenage girl, will go on their own to a swimming pool at night, and either they've broken in or the swimming pool's just been sort of left dormant for them to find, and they'll have a kind of sexy midnight swim session, usually accompanied by some sort of makeout or whatever. And it just like, it never occurred to me that there were so many of these. Like in planning the montages, obviously I thought like I'm going to come across loads of house parties, loads of graduations, loads of prom scenes. The idea that I would come across like 20 scenes with two people like on their own late at night in a swimming pool seemed this incredible stroke of luck. But then increasingly just seemed to feel like this perfect distillation of so many of the contradictions of that genre, where you would have, like a scene that's meant to be this incredibly unique, special thing, like this one-off of a thing that brings these two people together, and yet it's repeated ad infinitum, movie after movie after movie. But also that, like, its role in my film wasn't originally to signify a kind of fear of sexual intimacy. And I was thinking about these scenes in exactly the opposite way, that they were all these sort of like flirtatious dalliances late at night. But watching them through, you realize like half of them or more are about this terrible push and pull of teenage sexuality, and how they want nothing more than to be together, and yet they can't quite handle all of the feelings and bodily excitement that comes with it. And so the material completely suggested the interpretation that then followed. And I think both hopefully on a audiovisual level, and for me, while working on the film, it was a really informative thing.
Yeah. Oh, that's we didn't have a pool at my high school, so that's what that reminds me.
No, I mean, this is the thing. The number of times these things recur, you would think this was like a common rite of passage that everyone has had. And I mean, like, putting aside that, half the time it's the pool at the school, which, like you say, not every school has a swimming pool. but the other half, it's that someone's parents have a
Oh,
backyard
that's
pool.
yeah.
Which again speaks to the kind of very casual, unthinking, like class representation in these movies, that everyone's got a backyard pool that you can just stumble into late at night. And you know, like so many things in these movies, I didn't enjoy it because it was relatable. Like,
Yeah, exactly.
I wasn't having late night dalliances in swimming pools in people's back gardens. But yeah, there it is again and again.
Maybe instead of like asking you to think back on this very different time when you made the movie, here's a question. What's one piece of advice you wish you were told earlier on in your career?
I would say that, and I think this is true of a lot of people. I wouldn't like to speak for everyone, but it took me quite a while to realize that I would never be happy with work when it was done. Yeah. That like that wouldn't be. I always thought like you'll know it's done when you're just happy with it, when there's nothing else you want to change. And realizing that actually the moment it's done may be the moment you feel absolutely worst about it, and that it will take a significant amount of time after that to start feeling better and viewing it a little bit more objectively, was a hard lesson for me to learn. And with this, certainly, but even with subsequent films I made, like there was always like a really low ebb at one point where it was like, oh my God, I have thrown away untold hours of my life to this entirely pointless endeavor. And obviously, like, it's natural that these moments come when the movie is most unseen and unexposed, and like you have nothing but your own incredibly biased perspective to pay attention to. And the second other people watch it, and like some don't care about it, some don't like it, some do like it, you just realize like, oh, it's all a mess, and I'll just make my peace with that. But it took me a long time to learn that.
Well, I feel like something that I've read and always believed is that
7 years later, you're still like upgrading the footage in it to high definition for it to go on MUBI. So I don't even abandon it. I just keep throwing my time into this project.
Oh, yeah. Found footage movies are kind of rough for that. I guess something that I found, the first found footage thing I ever did was a video essay about cinema on trains, with the rule that you had to be on the train. And I feel like something that's like much to my horror since then is every movie I see, there's a sequence on a train and I'm like, oh, I didn't include it. Was there anything that you after the fact had wished that you had included that you didn't?
See, I can't think of any specific examples now, but there are constantly like, because even when I was making it, I would go to parties, and if people asked what I was up to and I said I was working on it, invariably they would then suggest movies that they grew up with. And it was incredible what they would up to. Like, you sort of, because that's the funny thing about these movies is like no one ever used to say that their favorite teen movie was Mean Girls or She's All That. Like, the answers were always bizarre, and not like obscure in a cool way, like they're trying to give a trendy answer. Like, it would just be, you know, that they were obsessed with Masterminds with the guy from Mad Men in it, or some Matthew Lillard film I'd never heard of, or like one of the really obscure Sarah Michelle Gellar ones. And yeah, just because like that was the one that maybe they had on video and watched the shit out of when they were 13, or they caught it on TV late at night or whatever. And so people would keep giving me stuff that I'd never heard of. And even after trawling through IMDb profiles, there would still be these surprises that I couldn't quite believe.
Are there any teen movies tropes that frustrate you? For example, I can't stand 30-year-old actors playing teenagers. Takes me right out of the film.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, the Beyond Clueless is full of those tropes, and hopefully they're all fairly ambivalently presented, because kind of like we were discussing earlier, like they all kind of represent to me this simultaneous intoxication and alienation. And I speak as someone who obviously didn't grow up in the States, so already there's like a total culture dislocation for me in watching these movies. And that for me was always kind of part of the pleasure, was the difference. And and therefore it became more of this sort of fantasy world that was sort of recognizably my experience, but only just. And so the tropes themselves became kind of a pleasure that they give you that comfort of familiarity, but not so familiar that it kind of sheds light on your own life too much. But that said, I think most of the like 30-year-olds had sort of flushed out of the system by the 90s and 2000s.
After seeing all of these films, how would you define the teenage motif / formula?
Yeah, I mean, I like a big theme of the film is definitely the impossible bind of the impossible binds of all kinds, but the expectation that I think is central to so many of these movies of being of fitting in with a crowd and simultaneously being a completely singular, independent being. And the way this needle is thread is so baffling, even as a viewer, let alone as a teenager trying to derive some sort of meaning and guidance from these movies, that I think they do set up this kind of impossible standard, or at least certainly did when I was an impressionable viewer watching them. Which is not to say that like teens are stupid and just sort of imbibing everything they see without scrutinizing it. Like I was a skeptical viewer, as I think most teenagers are. But you watch enough of these movies and it can't help but kind of inform your worldview to some extent. And I think the best we can do for the genre is kind of understand the ambivalence of that and not seek to flatten it out.
In thinking about kind of the thing we haven't talked a little bit about with the film, which I'm sure in part justified like the longer sections, when you spend a long time with the craft, when you spend a long time with the faculty, there's always narration over it. So you can spend a longer time with the film if you have the review or the critical thoughts kind of maybe being spoken or kind of directly being addressed. And so I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about that balance, but also, of course, how did you get your wonderful narrator, Fairuza Balk, involved?
Yeah, so you can, and like certainly in the UK, we used to have very narrow guidelines for our fair use equivalent, to the extent that lawyers just were not willing to push the boat out at all. And you would wind up with these very, very prescriptive TV documentaries, basically, where if they wanted to show a clip from anything, you would get narration over the top that was just the most pedantic, descriptive thing imaginable. And like, he reaches his arm up and touches the plant, and then he puts it back down on the desk, and he does this and he does that. And in their mind, that was like the only way to safely justify using the clip. Unfortunately, things had come on a little way since then, so we weren't quite as restricted, hence being able to craft those montage sequences, which have no narration and are, again, based on the idea that criticism can emerge from the juxtaposition of clips and the aggregation of clips. But I always knew that I wanted the film to be narration led and to have a kind of voice, because that was the kind of work I loved watching. And I think there's just inherently something really stimulating and really watchable, to use a word that I think a lot of people use kind of damningly, but I've always found quite a like meaningful word, about that combination of narration and imagery, especially film imagery, and the, you know, inherent opportunities it presents for juxtaposition and recontextualization and just a complete like rebirth of imagery. And so, yeah, I knew I wanted it to be narration led for the most part, and therefore you would be hearing a lot of someone's voice. And although I was, as a viewer, kind of outside that world, I didn't want the voice to necessarily be identifiable as an outsider. I felt like it had to kind of straddle that gap. And so I had this hit list, and number one with a bullet was Fairuza Balk, who not only has like the most amazing, distinctive voice imaginable, but also like in the types of roles that she took in these films was often kind of on the verge, insider, outsider, like part of the system, but with a kind of wry outsider gaze. And so, yeah, I like, I had absolutely no clue how to work with anyone or approach anyone or get anyone involved in any project I might ever do. And I just took wild stabs at achieving that aim, which is why it took about a year to finally make contact with her, which wound up being,
Oh, wow.
she had a, I don't know if she's still doing it, but she at the time had a bespoke candle making company that she sold candles through. I wish I could remember what it was called, but if you Google Fairuza Balk candles, I'm sure it will come up. And at the time, you could contact. There was like a contact page on the candle website, and so I used that. I'm ashamed to say.
The last thing I'll say to everyone out there watching, and anyone that watches maybe this after the fact, is that you should all watch Beyond Clueless, which is on MUBI. It's been restored in HD, if I understand it correctly.
It has indeed.
And it's, I don't know, I think it could bring a lot of joy to whoever watches it. There's so many good memories. It's so, I don't want to say expertly, I want to say it's been put together with such feeling and such an innate understanding of these films. And I think anyone that watches it will have a really wonderful time. And then Charlie, is there anything else you would like to say to everyone about the film?
No, thank you. I couldn't have put it better. That's lovely to hear. And yeah, certainly, like, I hope people get something out of it. It's already such a strange object to me, that this film that's like getting on for 10 years old and is then about movies that are 10 years older than that. It's like a kind of weird looking glass view on this period in teen cinema. And if nothing else, a very efficient way to watch 200 teen movies.